All right, welcome to part 3 of lesson 27, shoulder theory. We have already covered what shoulders are made of in terms of surface shapes and what to look at when you're constructing a shoulder. Now we only have one missing piece of the puzzle, and that is of course everything you have to know about pagoda shoulders, which we're going to cover in this lesson. So, the first thing that you have to understand is the name pagoda comes from the concave shapes that the rooftops of Asian monasteries have, and that's only just a reference. It's nothing to do with Asian monasteries. The second thing is that the pagoda shoulder is also known as a natural shoulder line. Why? Because as you saw in the previous parts, the entire shoulder of the average person is like a saddle. Therefore, having a saddle-like shoulder is a natural shoulder line. However, when you do a pagoda shoulder well, you'll notice that it's extremely striking and stylized. Therefore, not many people refer to it as a natural shoulder line because it doesn't look natural. Most of the time when people say natural shoulder line, they refer to a padless, soft, round shoulder. Anyway, that aside, we are here to discuss things from a technical perspective. From a technical perspective, a pagoda shoulder is a combination of 3 things. 1, the pad. 2, the canvas, which we have already gone through in lesson 15. And 3, the pattern of the jacket. If you have a purple box, that pattern is in your purple box. If you don't have one, get one. If you can't get one, go to our website and download the pattern there. Because we're not going to go through the jacket pattern in this module, and we have already covered the canvas construction, the one missing piece of our puzzle is going to be the pad. So this is what we're going to do. In this part, I'm going to talk you through the principles and everything you need to know about the layering and the construction of the pad. Then I'm going to show you how to draft one, and last but not least, we're going to make it. You ready? Let's go. Let's begin with an overview. What is our pad made of? We have 6 layers and each has its own purpose. You take one of these layers away and our pad is going to become less effective. Now, the first layer, which is one of the most important layers, is going to be the wadding. Wadding is going to be the elevator of our pad. It's what's going to extend our body into the silhouette that is required for our pagoda shoulder. On top of our wadding, we have a layer of color canvas. The purpose of this color canvas is to provide some firmness and some rigidity to the overall pad so that by the time the sleeves and the collar and everything is sewn together and they're dragging everything down, our pad is not flimsy, upholds its smooth shape. Very important. You take this layer away and you have a very soft and flimsy pad. Then we have 3 extra layers at the end of this color canvas on top of it. The purpose of these layers, Silesia, domette and wadding, is to provide extra rigidity by quilting them on the machine so that by the time the weight of the sleeve pulls down on the end of the pad does not dip in. Okay, we need a very smooth line all the way from the collar all the way to the shoulder end, okay? Then to cover everything and to cover the raw edges of the canvas, we use a layer of domette, which is cut on the bias, stretched to the shape that is required and neatly folded in so that the entire thing looks like one pad. Let me be clear about something. To make a structured garment does not mean put as much pad as you can inside that shoulder. A lot of people say, oh, you know, this is a very structured garment. It has a lot of padding. More pad does not mean more structure. More pad does not mean more pagoda. It just means you don't have the skills to achieve the same results with less, okay? And we are here to go through everything you need to know, starting with the layering principles of the wadding to get you to the level that you can achieve maximum results with the least amount of effort. I want to emphasize the point I just made about the building of the pad. When we are making a jacket with pagoda shoulders, we are not just building a massive pad, okay? I have to repeat that because it's extremely important. I have two drawings here. The upper one is what we should have. The lower one is what we shouldn't have. Obviously, you can have it if you want, but here is why you shouldn't have it. We have to make use of all the elements around the neck, shoulder, and sleeve to help us give a concave illusion, a concave silhouette with the least amount of effort. That means that our construction design has to be clever. Everything has to just be a little bit manipulated, not one thing manipulated a lot. So here, in the correct example, we have a high collar, which accentuates the transition of the neck into the shoulder. Then we have, a moderately built pad topped off with a robed sleeve. All of these together gives the illusion of a very hollow shoulder line without us having to actually make a super hollow shoulder. The example where things are not really well done is a very low collar. So we are losing the accent that we have, the detail from the transition from the neck into the shoulder. Then we have a flat sleeve head, which is not emphasizing the shoulder ends. So then that requires us to make a massive pad. Not good, okay? Now that you understand this, let's talk about this pad and how it should be layered. One of the most important foundations of our pad is how the layers are built. Now you might think, we just take our sheets of wadding like so, and we build them up until we have a beautifully elevated pad. And if you look at it from the top, what you'll see is this is your layers of wadding, and everything is nice and smoothly stacked on top, so that it transitions in a smooth flow. There is, however, a problem with this. This is not the correct way to layer the wadding for your pagoda shoulder pad. Why? Well, as soon as we introduce a sleeve, which is going to be sewn around the armhole, then that armhole is going to be sewn to the canvas and the canvas to the pad. Then on top of that, there's going to be a layer of a sleeve head roll. There is so much tension going on there that elevating our pad like this will just crush the end almost all the way to the end, and we are going to have a very ugly silhouette once the jacket is finished. This is what the silhouette is going to look like. It's going to start from the neck, going to the shoulder, then dip into the end of the shoulder, and then you have your sausage or your sleeve hanging there from the shoulder end. Not good. So the question is, how should we layer our pad? We have to layer our pad to create a hockey stick curve, like so, to exaggerate it for a moment. So when you build up your layers, and then you look at the distance at which they are spaced out, you will notice that the space between the layers gets shorter and shorter and shorter, significantly, okay? And it gets smaller and smaller. Whereas here, the distance between the edges of the layers of wadding is almost equal. So when you look at this from the top, what you see is something like this. That's a huge difference, okay? Everything is concentrated at the end here. By the time you introduce your sleeve and you do all of the stitching around the armhole, if there is going to be any dipping at the shoulder end here, it's only going to be right at the end there. Something that the eye may not even pick up, okay? So the silhouette is just going to be a smooth shoulder, hollow, no dipping, and then you have your roped sleeve, okay? This is extremely important to understand. I would encourage you to make a few pads, play around with the different layering plans so that you have a better understanding. Now that you know this, you may have a question. Based on what do I determine the height of my pad? The thickness of our pad depends mainly on the individual's anatomy that we are building the pad for. If you look at someone with square shoulders, you just need a small pad to create the illusion of a concave line, whereas if you look at someone with sloped shoulders, you need a very thick pad, pretty much double the size of that to create the same silhouette. While both of them are possible from a technical point of view, when you're about to make one of these pads, especially the thicker one for the sloped individual, you have to consider the things, the factors, the impact the thick pad is going to have on the armhole. What is that impact? It's the following. Imagine you have the individual with very sloping shoulders. So the arms, their chest, and the side of their body, and this is the center front, okay? Very Egyptian. And here we have the individual with the very square shoulders. Again, the arm, the chest, the sides, and the center front, okay? Now, when you build a pad, you are essentially extending their anatomy, as I mentioned before. It's always the fabric and the canvas covering the body plus the pad, not canvas, fabric, pad covering the body, okay? So you always have to see this as part of the anatomy. When you introduce a shoulder pad on both of these individuals, you have a very small pad achieving that concave line, and here you have a seriously thick pad to achieve that line. Now, there's a problem here. The problem is that when you take the base of your armhole on both individuals, which is set, and then you introduce an extension on top of the natural shoulder, which is a little bit here and a lot here, you have to increase the shoulder angle on your pattern so that the fabric can cover the body plus the pad. So here, your armhole, because your shoulder angle goes higher, your armhole has to meet the top of the pad. And here, the same thing, your armhole has to meet the top of the pad, which in this case is a lot higher. So here, the armhole is a lot deeper than here. What's wrong with it? Well, when we are fitting a garment, we want the armhole and the sleeve to be as close to the person's body as possible. We don't want to deviate too much from the natural body. Why is that important? Well, here is why. When we introduce the sleeve to this jacket, this sleeve has to go around the armhole circumference like so. And to some extent, because there is a little pad, there's going to be a little bit of emptiness above the individual's natural shoulder line. Now, when it's a little bit, it's okay. People expect it. It's a jacket. It's a pagoda shoulder. So there's obviously some padding. But when you do the same thing here and you introduce the sleeve, that sleeve, first of all, is going to look really long on the front side, which already looks unnatural. When you're creating bespoke garments, you want the garments to look as an extension of the individual's body. So anything that looks unnatural is already not really that good. But on top of that, you have this massive space of literally nothing. It's just fluff, literally. Why is that bad? The reason why that's bad is when you move your arms upwards, because of this gap between your arm and the top of the shoulder, you're going to have a break there, okay? Now, the thicker the pad, the bigger the area above the break. When you have this massive break, it's not really elegant visually. Now, technically, it could be perfectly executed, but visually, the garment is going to look unnatural. It's going to look forced on the individual. It's not going to look like it's grown on them. So you, as a cutter and tailor, have to be aware of these consequences when you make these technical choices. So the thickness of your pad not only depends on the individual's anatomy and the degree to which their shoulders are square or sloped, but also the impact a very thick pad is going to have on the armhole, the sleeves, and the rest of the aesthetics of that garment. Now that we have covered all these fundamental principles about the pad, we are ready to move on and to draft the pattern for our pad, which we're going to use to cut out the canvas section of our shoulder pad. Let's do this. If you're following our lessons with our purple box, then you already have a pattern for your shoulder pad, your pagoda shoulder pad in your bundle. If you don't have our purple box, I recommend you get it. If you can't get it, you can still download the pattern that we use for the modules ahead on our website. However, if you're working with your own pattern or you just want to know the formula with which you can make a pagoda shoulder pad, this is the moment that you're going to learn it. What we're going to end up with is a shoulder pad like this. It's not going to have all these lines, but these lines indicate the sequence that you have to follow through and what the purpose of each line is. So let's begin. Take your front panel and your back panel. I want you to place the shoulder lines together, that is the sewing lines of the shoulders, and join your shoulder seams together and trace it just like I've done. You don't have to do the break line, I've just done that for clarity purposes, but it's very important for you to mark the top of your back side seam, the front pitch on your front side, your entire armhole shape here, and your entire neck curve, all right? Once you've done that, I want you to mark one end of your sewing line and the other and connect it with a straight line. If you use our pattern, you will notice that the shoulder lines of our patterns are curved. That is because of the seam design that I talked to you about earlier. Ignore that, just mark the ends of your sewing line and connect it with a straight line. Once you've done that, you are ready to go through this sequence. The first thing we have to do is to draw the pad outline. That's going to be the major shape of our shoulder pad. Now, we want our shoulder pad to exactly reflect our specific pattern. So if you have your own pattern, you don't want to end up with a too small pad or a too big of a pad. So what do we do? The first thing you have to do is to mark a point on the front pitch of your front side and a point on the top of your back side seam, like that. Why these specific points? Because we require to cover the shoulder enough for the pad to have impact on the entire construction and silhouette of the shoulder and to support the sleeve head roll once it goes around the shoulder pad. Then we have to mark the neck side of our pad. From your sewing line, that is the sewing line of your shoulder, mark 1.5 inches over into the back neck. That's about 4 centimeters. So you're going to make a point here, and I want you to do exactly the same into the front neck curve. Once you've done that, I want you to connect the lines for the front panel with a straight line, like so. And I want you to connect the ones on the back panel with a very subtle curve. So if you would draw a straight line, you could add 1 centimeter or 1/2 inch in the middle, and that would be roughly the curve that you'd get. Don't give me a half circle, just a subtle curve like this, okay? Now we need to mark the neck and the armhole side of our pad. For the perfect silhouette, we require to create a line that really transitions from the neck into the shoulder. Therefore, we need our shoulder pad to go slightly beyond our neck curve into our neck. That is going to be about 1/2 inch, 1.2, 1.5 centimeters, but really not any more than that. So mark 1/2 inch or 1.2 into the neck right along your shoulder seam sewing line. Also, once we have sewn in the pad and the sleeves are attached to it, for the finishing purposes, we need to trim the edges of the pad. To trim things easy and successfully, we require a little bit of extra pad, kind of like a cutting allowance. But don't give me 1 inch extra. All you need is 5 millimeters or 1/4 inch at the base, 5 millimeters or 1/4 along the shoulder sewing line, and 3/8 at the very base back end of the pad. Why does this have to be a bit wider? The reason for that is we don't have any canvas here apart from our wing pad. Now, we don't always have a wing pad. Therefore, we require our pad to provide extra support so that it can lay really flat against our body, so that once the sleeve head roll is sewn around the sleeve, it can really hold it up. Otherwise, it will collapse and it's not going to be a pretty sight, okay? So that's why. All right, so once you've drawn all these points, I want you to connect them with roughly the same style of curve as you have on your armhole, and you can connect this like that as well. Now, that is roughly the outline of our pad and the orientation of it. The next thing we require are the darts. Obviously, we have to create a saddle-like shape for our shoulder pads, and we can do that in like a million ways, but me, having made like 400 pads, have got to the conclusion that 2 darts placed like this are the most effective and simple way to create maximum shape. Why 2 darts? Why not just 1 across the shoulder? Here is why. Whenever you create a dart along the shoulder seam and you close that dart like that, you are indeed creating a saddle-like surface. However, whenever this bends around the body and you fill it up with wadding and you stitch through the pad, through the wadding, you will lose a lot of this shape. If you want to create that shape and maintain it with just 1 dart, you have to create a very large dart. And as I mentioned before, it's never good to manipulate one area too much. It's always better to manipulate multiple areas a little bit. Therefore, once we have closed this dart, we need a second dart across, which almost acts like a lever, pinching the center, elevating the ends, like so. And by doing that, permanently creating a saddle that is not going to lose its shape once it's stitched together with all the thick layers of wadding. Okay? So that's why we require 2 darts, okay? 1 goes along the shoulder line and the other across it from the back to the front. So let's draw our darts. I want you to identify the midpoint between your neck curve of your pattern and the shoulder point. So that's going to be here. Then I want you to square from your shoulder seam line upwards like this, and also mark your actual shoulder seam line like this, okay? Once you've got that, it's time to add the intake that is going to create the shape. Now, intake is subjective. You can do 1 inch if you want to create a crazy pad, or you can do 5 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch if you want to have something subtle. Again, based on my experience, I've noticed that 1/4 of an inch gives the most elegant line without being too dramatic or theatrical. So we are going to do 1/4 of an inch. What do? We add 1/4 of an inch on either side of the center lines of our darts. So right, left, top, bottom, just like that, okay? Then what we're going to do is we're going to connect the intakes to the ends of our dart, to the ends of our dart points, let's say, or the edge of our pattern, like that. And like that, okay? That's your darts done. Now, one thing that's going to happen is when we cut out these darts, we are essentially removing material from the surface of our pad. So when the dart legs join together, these outer lines are going to be pulled inwards, which is going to make our pad smaller. Therefore, we need the third step, which is going to be the dart intake compensation. Sounds like an insurance policy, but it's just dart intake compensation. Whatever you remove from your dart, you add to exactly the same areas that you are removing it. So what we are going to do is, since we have added 1/4 here, that's our intake, we're going to add 1/4 here, same on this side, same on this side, and same on this side, like that. Now, normally, I don't draw all these lines, but for now I will draw them so that you have clarity. Once you have made 20 pads, you know exactly what lines to draw and which ones to skip. So what I will do is I will connect these points together as smoothly as I can, like so, and end into 0 there where my dart ends into 0, okay? So this goes to 0 because our horizontal dart ends 0 there and 0 there. And then here we have another intake that ends up in 0 and that ends up in 0 as well. So like that. And here we have already done. Okay, that's now compensation for our darts done. After that, we want to make everything a lot simpler for ourselves by adding seam allowances. And that's the 4th step. We don't want to cut out our pad pattern, then add seam allowances, too much fiddling around. So we can just add seam allowances exactly along the lines where we're going to have our intakes. Now, pay attention. Our seam allowance can be anything, but for practicality purposes, I believe it has to be 5 millimeters because too wide of a seam allowance creates a lot of bulk on your pad and you don't want that, okay? So we're always gonna, on our pad, make seam allowances of 5 millimeters. That's a foot's width. Now, this is where you have to pay attention. We're gonna have a sewing line here, that's our dart leg. That is gonna require 5 millimeters addition of seam allowance, which we're gonna add on the outer edge here. Then we have another dart leg here. That's also gonna have 5 millimeters. Same for these horizontal ones. And so that is all gonna be added on the outer edges. Now we're gonna trace the entire outer shape, which is the red line, 5 millimeters away from it. And that's gonna be our seam allowance added to the entire pad. And this time we are going to go all around by the amount that we have assigned for our seam allowance, like so. So that is our shoulder pad. One thing you're going to notice is that we have a gap between the ends of our darts and the edge of our pattern. Here we don't have it. The reason why we have a gap here is because I'm trying to explain to you step by step what each of these is going to do and how it's translated onto our pattern. Normally, when I draft the pattern myself, I don't draw the dart legs until I have completely drawn the outlines, and then I basically just connect it all the way to the very end. So I do mark whatever the intake is, and I compensate for that. I also add my seam allowances. Once I've done the outer lines, then I just connect my dart intake to the ends of my pattern edge, okay? So that's the first step of drafting your own pattern. The next step is obviously cutting it out and truing the seams of our darts. Let's do that on our board. So once you've drafted your pattern on paper, you should end up with something like this. I have erased all the lines that are not relevant anymore and kept the very outer line along with my darts. I've removed the neck circle, everything else, okay? So before we cut anything out, we need to make our lines a little bit more sophisticated. At the moment, our darts are just going like bah, in and out. There is no sophistication to it. So what we want to do is to take a piece of chalk or graphite. You can also use a subtle curved ruler if that's easier for you. And what we're going to do is we're going to hollow these lines so that they are smooth from the beginning all the way to the very end. It is okay to slightly deviate from your intake point, but please try to keep to this point as much as you can. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hollow these lines, hit my intake point, hollow until I'm at the end there. I'll do the same on this side, hollow, hit my intake, hollow at your boy. And do the same with the other darts across. Like that. That's a lot better. That's going to give our pattern and our pad a lot more smoothness once everything goes together. So, how are we going to proceed? The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to just cut through the center line of our vertical dart. Whoops. Okay? Like that. Then we're going to cut along one of our dart legs all the way from bottom to the top. That's on the curved line, of course. And then what we're going to do, make a snip in the middle right here, flip your pattern over and see if your curves are roughly matching together. If not, move your pattern around, take a pencil and use one of your curves as an example for the other one, like so. Now, since my curves are matching, I can just proceed and cut out like so. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut one of these dart legs, any of them, doesn't matter. Flip it over and make sure that the corner of my pattern matches the corner that I have here. And then again, I cross-reference this and see if my lines are matching. In my case, they do. I hope they do in yours as well. And if they do, you can continue cutting the rest of your line. Same goes for here. Flip over. Make sure the center corners are always your starting point. See if the curves are matching. In my case, they do. And cut away. Now, one thing I have to emphasize is when you flip your pattern over, you're not supposed to check the horizontal lines against the horizontal lines of the same side. So let's say this is back 1, this is back 2, this is front 1, this is front 2. You have a horizontal line going from back 1 to back 2. That's this line. This is not the line that you're supposed to true. You're supposed to true the vertical lines of the backs, the vertical lines of the fronts, and then if you want to do the horizontal line, your horizontal line should always be back to front, like that, and back to front again, like so. Okay? That's very important because what happens is if you get your horizontal line on your fronts, you're not going to sew them like that. So there's no point in truing them in that manner. Now, when you bring your 0 points together again, you'll have the negative space of your darts like that. Now, it's important to have grain lines. You can add your grain lines before you cut anything out, or you can add them later on. If you forget to add them before you cut your darts out, you have to position everything as I have done, 0 point to 0 point, like so. Put a ruler on top and make sure that the vertical lines that you draw are parallel to your vertical dart, like so, on both front 2, back 2, and front 1 and back 1. And your horizontal grain lines with your horizontal darts. Now, obviously, we're going to cut on a plain weave color canvas, so we don't need to mark a horizontal and a vertical grain line, but both would be fine. You can either mark horizontally or vertically, as long as the orientation is parallel to your darts, okay? So, next thing, this is what I want you to do. I want you to put your back 1 and back 2 together, okay? And mark a seam off here, that's a foot's width, a seam off here, align them, okay? And you'll notice that if you align your sewing lines and make a mark here, you're roughly 3/8 away from the edge, okay? So continue that distance by flipping this over and continuously aligning your edges with a distance of 3/8 from one another until you reach the very bottom. Then you'll notice that you have a point here, okay? So obviously when you sew your pattern, you want to have a smooth curve. So what you can do is to grab your chalk, your pencil, whatever, and to just gently shave a little bit off so that you have a nice curve. Don't make a square because once we get to make the pad, you'll notice you end up with a lot of bulk. Don't make the point too sharp. Just make a nice curve like I have now, okay? So once you have that, you can press your pencil a little bit more, or you can even punch a few holes through it so that you know exactly where that is, and you can cut away, okay? Now, don't cut all the way until you've done exactly the same with these two. So again, we have a seam away from the edge. Align your edges with the distance of a seam allowance. Mark, follow, and you'll see that there is a gap now there, okay? So what you have to do is very simple. Connect the very end to this very end by just going through it like that. And you can ignore this part here, okay? So you can cut this away and you can cut this away. I did a terrible job here. Obviously that's not acceptable. So I'll just try to smooth this out like so, okay? So front one is done partially, back one is done. Now we have to do the same here. So we can get the front two and back two together, a distance of 3/8 between the edges, start from the center, make sure they are perfectly aligned, then move all the way, keep that distance all the way to the very end, and you see a discrepancy here. You can follow from the back into the front. You don't have to follow from the front into the back because that will lead you to no man's land. This is where the oasis is. There's nothing to be found there. You can just go from the back to the front, okay? And that's that. Now we can cut this, hopefully smoother this time, like so, and same for here, like so. And that leaves us with one more panel. Again, we always start from the center, connect these, 3/8 distance, follow through to the very end, and then just smooth the area between them, like so. Now you may wonder, is it better to go from left to right, right to left? Doesn't really matter, as long as your lines are very close. You can just smooth out from this side as well. You end up in the same place. So you can cut these together, and that's your shoulder pad. We have a front one, front two, back one, back two. The grain lines are either parallel to the horizontal dart or the vertical darts. Why does the grain line have to be parallel to this dart orientation? The reason is this area being on the straight grain creates a bias line on these areas. Now, these are the areas that will connect from the shoulder into the neck. Once we cut it out from canvas, you'll notice that it's extremely important for this part to be flexible so that when the neck hits against the pad, we can stretch this out and allow it to lay flat smoothly against the body. If your grain lines are going diagonally across, this area falls on the straight grain and you will never get an elegant line, okay? Now, the idea is to sew these panels together, starting from the middle, have a smooth transition, like so. Same here. So front one gets sewn to front two, back one to back two. Once that is done, these get sewn together like that. And then once we are done, we have a shoulder pad, okay? Let's cut this out from our canvas. So grab your canvas. If you have purchased our bundle, inside your bundle, you will find a piece of color canvas cut on the straight grain with the selvages on either side. You also have another piece of color canvas which is cut on the bias and the edges are diagonal. Do not use that piece. Use the piece that looks like this. If you don't have our bundle, the best thing you can do is to find a color canvas that feels stiff, rigid, but not something that is like a cardboard. You still have to be able to iron it, okay? So let's begin. First, we have to make sure that we flatten and straighten our material. Next, what we have to do is to take our pattern pieces and to see exactly how we have to lay them so that we can cut everything out without falling short of material. Now, it's important that all your panels are laid on your canvas according to the grain line, and so that could be a starting point for you. You can either align it vertically with your selvage or horizontally, okay? So let's see, how can we puzzle this? Now, as you can see, I have flipped one of the panels, that's my B1 panel, over, but I am still keeping the grain line matched to the grain of the canvas. Now, since I've managed to fit everything on half of my material, I can easily keep them as they are, fold my material in half, like so, crease it with the iron, and then put them back on my canvas, like so. Now, when you cut this out, because the material is very stiff, you have to be very careful and hold everything well in place. But take a pencil or a Sharpie, a pen, anything, and try to get as much coverage as possible. So I will use this black inky pen so that you can see what I'm doing, and I will trace everything all around. Once we have traced everything, I will guarantee you that once everything is cut and you're about to machine them together, you will be confused. These are all shapes that look very similar to one another. So therefore, I recommend you write the name of each panel, whatever you have put on your pattern, on each piece that you trace. So in this case, this is going to be F1 for me, which I've placed upside down. This is going to be B2. This is going to be B1. And this is going to be F2. Time to cut these out. Hold your hands really firmly on your material as close as you can to the edge of your pattern and start cutting away. Use the point of your shears so that you don't elevate the material more than necessary, and carefully cut into these lines. When you're about to cut a new line, make sure that your previous cut edges are aligned. You don't want them to kind of like overlap in the other direction, you cutting the line and finding out that they're not the same size. As soon as you cut a pair, what I want you to do is to flip it and mirror them and write the same code or the same name on the opposite side. This way you can pair everything easily, and when you're at the machine, you're not going to accidentally sew one back to the front of the wrong piece or in reverse. Okay, so this is one pair. Let's cut the rest. Okay, so once you've cut everything, it is time to first lay everything as it should be and then pin them together and bring them to the machine. So what are we going to do? We're going to do the following. We're going to have a front 1. We're going to have a front 2. We're going to have a front 1 here and a front 2 here. And as you can see, they are mirrored so that we have a left side and a right side. Then we have a back 2, which is going to go to front 2. So front 2 and back 2 are the same. And the same is going to happen here. Then we have a back 1, which is going to go here, and a back 1, which is going to go here. So we have one pair of shoulder pads, one for the left side, one for the right side. Now, this is what's going to happen. You're going to flip over. So this is the, let's say the right side is now facing us with the numbers on. You're going to flip B1 over to F1 and B2 over to F2. And you're going to do that on both like that. And you'll place them on one another like so. Keep them separate and leave it to the side because we're now going to cut the strips that are required to machine these together. So grab your Silesia, open up your Silesia. And the previous time we used our Silesia was when we wanted to cut that side piece for our canvas construction. So all I want you to do now is to take the raw edge of your Silesia, press it smooth and flat, like so, grab a ruler. And what we need are 4 strips in total, 2 for one pad and 2 for the other. And the strips have to be as long as your pad is. So if I bring this back, and I can't give you a measure because every time your pad may be a different length, but when I bring this back, it has to be essentially as long as the length. So in this case, it's about 9 inches. We'll give it a bit extra, 9 inches, and 8 inches. We can do strips of 9 inches in total, okay? Our strips have to be at least 3/4, that's 2 centimeters, but we can also do strips of 1/2 inch, which is a little bit less, like so. There isn't really a big difference, as long as you just have a strip of at least 1/2 inch, maximum 3/4, maximum 2 centimeters. So let's cut this on the double. And you don't have to be perfectly on the straight grain. As long as you're on the straight grain, that's enough. So if I fold this in half, cut this through, that's probably going to give me more than 9 inches, and that's plenty. So I have 2 for one pad and 2 for the other pad, okay? So remove your Silesia. Let me give you an overview, and then we're going to go to the machine. So this is what's going to happen. This is our pad. B1 is going to go to front 1. B2 is going to go to front 2. We are going to machine from the center outwards, press our seams open, and then B1 is going to go to B2, F1 to F2. Since these two are already sewn together, they're going to go right side to right side. We're going to machine from the center outwards, press our seam open again, and then we have our shoulder pad. Then we're going to take the strip, sew it on top, zigzag, sew the other strip, zigzag, and that will be the shell for our shoulder pad, okay? Let's do this. Okay, so just to recap, we are going to sew B2 to F2 by flipping it over and sew from the center outwards. We're not going to sew from the center upwards, okay? That's very important. And we're going to do the same for B1 and F1. We're going to flip B1 over onto F1 and sew from the center outwards, not upwards. Now, the whole purpose for doing that is so that we join this panel together and this panel, and then flip them on top of one another and sew the 2 remaining seams. You can also, obviously, sew B1 and B2 together and then go from the center downwards and do the same for F1 and F2 from the center upwards, which will join the panels just slightly differently, but you'll still have to then flip both over and sew them together, okay? Whichever way you do it, both are correct as long as you do it according to what I just explained, okay? So let's put this aside, let's start. I'm gonna put B2 on F2. Make sure your alignment is perfect. Start from the center. Have a small stitch length, as small as you can have. I have it on 1 millimeter. Make sure your edges are perfectly aligned. You do not have to do a back tack, just hold both of your threads and carefully start machining a foot's width away from the edge of your foot. And as you finish, again, you do not have to do a back tack if your stitch length is very small. So that's that. And now what you have to do is to just use your fingers, cut the remaining of the threads, obviously. Use your fingers, open up the seam. You do not have to use your iron here. And with the end of your scissors, you can just crease this open like that. It is very, very, very important that your center is not mismatching and that it creates one continuous line. Okay, so we now have B2 and F2 together. It's now time to get B1 onto F1 and then sew from the center downwards. Again, make sure everything is aligned. This time we have to align the foot's width on the other side of the foot. Grab both of your threads, start sewing. Open your seam, and now we have 2 panels. Now what you have to do is to flip your B1 and F1 over and make sure that you really match the seams well, okay? Do not offset them. If you offset them, you will not get a good harmony and therefore not a good shape. So make sure they are perfectly aligned and start from the center, sewing both ways, okay? One at a time. So that's one side. Make sure your seam allowance is folded open and it's not folded back on itself. And we can now do the other side. Start a little bit backwards on your line so that you continue the remainder of that line without having a break in your thread in the middle. Cut your thread and now open up your seams just like you did before. If you notice that your seams are splitting open in the middle here, that's absolutely fine. If anything, you really do want that to happen because that gives freedom for the pad to lay as it should lay without anything tying it up from underneath. Now we have our shoulder pad. All the edges match because we have trued our pattern as good as we could. And now it's time to apply our tape. So, doesn't matter which side you start to zigzag on, but this is how you would have to do it. Put your tape on, allow a little bit of excess, and center your seam with that of the tape. You do not need a very wide tape, 1/2 inch is plenty. Then start machining with a slightly bigger stitch. In my case, that's going to be a 3, and align one edge of your foot with the center of the tape, machining the side of that tape, and as you machine, lift it up so that you can keep aligning the edge of the foot with the center of the tape, which is aligned with the seam. Once you reach the end, just square over and machine the rest of this edge. Obviously, I would want you to use the same color as you have as your canvas and your tape, but because you need to see what I'm doing and everything needs to be visible, I'm using a black color. So that's one tape. Do not cut the tape off, leave the ends because this is going to help you with the zigzag. Now we're going to do the other tape exactly the same way. Once you reach the end, keep your needle in. We now have machined both tapes. It's now time to do a zigzag. So what you need to do is to align your tape horizontal to you, that's parallel to your eyes. Loosen the foot tension of your machine so that it can easily go up and down. Grab the tape. First, machine a little bit along the edge shape, like so. And now you can start zigzagging all the way up to the very end, like so. So that's one side. You can cut the thread and really try to go completely over the edge of your tape, like so, and make sure that your seam underneath is flat. We are not machining our tape over the seam. This is going to be covered with the wadding, which is thick and fluffy, okay? Now the other seam. Cut your thread in your tape and the remainder of the tapes all around. And you should end up with something like this, okay? I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side. When you do the other side, make sure you have everything positioned so these two shells mirror one another. You don't want to end up with two sides being exactly the same, all right? We now have two pads which are ready to be taken to the next stage. If you've done everything correctly, you should end up with a pair that is mirrored from one another, and your zigzag stitches should be roughly 1 centimeter, that is 3/8, apart from one another. Now what I want you to do is to trim away all these threads. What you can do is you can put your shoulder pads together so that you're cutting both at the same time, aligning the edges that you're cutting, carefully trimming away all the bits that are sticking out, and you can do that on all sides, and like so. And then what I want you to do is to shape your pads with the iron. Now, why are we going to do that? When we are stitching our pads through the wadding, we are going to lose some of this shape. So at the moment, it has a lot of shape. It is going to maintain that shape. However, some of it is going to go. So we are going to stretch out these two areas, B1 and B2, to give it a little bit more shape so that by the time we have stitched through all the layers, we have all the shape that we need. Something else that I want to highlight is that you may wonder, why did we seam these seams? And why did we not just cut a raw edge and then join them together with a tape as we did on the canvas construction? The reason for that is very simple. Because we have two darts crossing one another, it will be a lot more complicated to use a strip to join these together, and it's a lot more effective and efficient to just use seams. So I'm going to stretch as you should stretch, and then once we've done that, I'm going to explain to you how and what we have to cut to create our pad. Okay, so grab your spray bottle and spray the area B1 and B2 a little bit wet. Take your iron, go over that area once to remove some of that excess moisture, and then gently, don't overdo it, gently stretch each side which has been falling on the bias. You will notice that your canvas feels very wet and soft and pliable. That's a good thing. As it dries, it becomes more rigid and stiff. So that's one side, and now the other. And you can then slowly blend your iron, bring it into the center so that you have a smooth shape. You can rotate it around. I'm not shaping any of these areas. I'm just bringing the iron to smooth everything out. We now have a little bit more shape because of the stretching of this area, B1 and B2, okay? So I'm going to do the same to the other side, and then I'm going to explain to you all you need to know about your wadding, domette, and Silesia. Now, normally, what you also can do is to put these together once you have a bit more control and experience, like so. Pin F2 and F1 together, and then shape both of these at the same time, one side at a time. I'm just going to double check to see if both of them are exactly the same, and if not, go over them one more time as I'm holding them on the double. You should have something like this. It's a very exaggerated shape. It's not going to stay like that. This area is all going to be flattened a little bit by the tension of the stitching. But let's go ahead and give you some explanation in regards to the wadding that we're going to cut. I've already explained in the theory of the Pagoda shoulder pad what materials and layers our pad is made of. But now that we're going to put all of that into action, I have to specify a few more details. So, exactly how are we going to cut the layers of our wadding, our domette, and our Silesia? Imagine that this blue thing is our body. Here's the neck, here's the shoulder, and then it fades into the arm. Our pad is going to be roughly from this cross here, and it's going to end more or less parallel to the deltoid muscle, okay? Now, the first layer that we need for wadding is going to be one that spans from one end of the pad all the way to the other. Then, if you remember that hockey stick that I talked to you about, to get that hockey stick, we need to take the length of this and then half it for our second layer, which is going to be something like this. On top of that, we're going to half that again and put another layer, which gives us now 3 layers, okay? We're going to have 6 layers of wadding in total. So, therefore, we're going to layer the top one more time, which gives us the smallest piece, and that is going to be our 4th layer. What are we going to do with the other 2? Now, the first thing that you notice is that the base of our pad misses this area and has all of this emptiness. Nobody is perfectly square. Our shoulders always round off into our arms. So to provide a little bit more support there and to prevent the end of the pad collapsing, our 5th layer is going to be right there, which is going to be the same size as the upper one. Now, according to the principle, we would have to half this one more time to create the most upper layer, but that's not going to be very practical. What's going to happen is we're going to end up with a very tiny amount of wadding, and then once we fade the edges, nothing is going to be left. So, because we have to reinforce the ends of our canvas with some quilting, as I mentioned before, we're going to duplicate this layer, put this on top right here on our canvas shell. So our canvas is going to be covering all of these layers right here, except for the very last one, okay? That wadding is going to come on top. It's going to be covered with a layer of domette, which is this yellow line here. And on top of that, we're going to get our layer of Silesia, okay? Now, obviously, we're going to quilt this upper end first and then bother with these layers underneath. So once we have put our wadding, our domette, and our Silesia at the very end of the pad, we're going to quilt these on the machine to create a very firm shoulder end. Why do we need that? As I explained before, once the sleeve goes into the armhole, it's going to pull everything down, and we don't want to end up with a dip for something that actually needs to have a very elegant line all the way to the very end. So once we've done that, we're going to cover everything with another layer of domette, like so, and there's going to be a layer of domette underneath here, like that. And once we have that, everything is going to be stitched together, which is going to compress some of our layers to some extent and make things a bit firmer. Now, if you're working with our purple box, you will have your wadding in there. Our wadding is pretty thick. It's about 1 inch as it is, but when you compress it and stitch through it, it's going to end up like 1/4, 3/8. Chances are that if you're working with your own materials, you're not going to find the wadding that thick. If you have thinner wadding, I recommend you stick to this principle of these 6 layers, but instead double each layer or triple each layer. Because if your wadding is like 1/4 of an inch uncompressed and you compress it, it's going to end up like 2 millimeters, and that's not going to be enough. So that is that. Now that you understand all of this, let's go ahead and cut our wadding. Grab your wadding, open it up. This is the wadding from our purple box, and you have to open it very carefully because inside the wadding you'll see some of the goodies that you're going to need during the process of making your jacket. We have our basting cotton, which you probably have already taken out. We have the chalk, which you have already probably taken out. We have our bonded nylon, which is going to be used for our buttons. We have our gimp, which is going to be used for our buttonholes. We have our buttonhole thread. We have our waxed silamide, our double-sided fusing, and of course our wadding. Now we are going to need the waxed silamide to stitch through the pad once everything is basted, and we're going to baste them not with the needles that are included with the waxed silamide, but with the needles that we have in our basting thread. These are a little bit bigger. These are a number 5, whereas these are a number 7, and these are good for padding canvases and collars and lapels, but they are going to be too small for padding or stitching through the pad, okay? So one thing I have to mention is that this is going to make a lot of mess. This is fluffy and it's going to go everywhere. So make sure that you have some sort of a lint roller and move this as little as you can. It's very good to have some sort of a Sharpie pen for marking it because it's very difficult to mark with a pencil or a pen. And with this, you can just make dots and easily cut everything out, okay? Now, this specific wadding that I have in front of me has 2 sides. One side is machine quilted with a needle punch, and the other side is a little bit more fluffy. I would recommend to keep the needle punch side on your board to create less friction and therefore less mess, all right? So let's move this away and start cutting our wadding. So take one of your canvas shells and put this in one of the corners like so. Now you may have to flatten this. It doesn't matter that this is very three-dimensional. You can just flatten it like this. And we are going to cut an area of 1/2 inch into this entire shell. So it's going to be the same shape, but the sides are going to be 1/2 inch inwards. That's about 1.2 centimeters inwards. The edge, however, is going to remain the same. So bring this a little bit over into the edge, like so. Then put something heavy on top so that it doesn't move. Grab your Sharpie and start marking with dots the edges of your canvas. Now, these edges I would recommend to mark 1/2 inch inwards. If you want, you can create a guide for yourself all around your canvas to follow if that's easier. I'll just do it by eye, and that's going to be fine. Like that. Now, this is our first layer, and we're going to cut this out in a moment. Before we cut it out, I have to just draw this for you so that you know exactly what we're doing. So the first one is as big as this entire canvas shell. The second one is going to start from the middle, as I said. If you take the center of the pad and the very outer edge, divide this into 3 and mark at the one outer third on both sides. So again, this divided by 3, mark on the outer third a line, okay? And then connect this right here along with the midpoint right here. Now try to mimic the shape that I've drawn. Don't create a square, don't make it too flat, create it as smooth as you can. Now the next one is going to be from the end and the marking midway, from the end and the marking midway, from the end and the marking midway, like so. Whoops. Like so. Okay, it's a bit square here. Try to make it as smooth as possible. And then the next one is going to be midway, midway again, and midway again. And that's going to be like that. Okay, so we need one of this one. Sorry, one per pad, so 2 in total. 2 of this one, 2 of this one, and then 6 in total for this one. We need 3 per pad, okay? 1 for the quilted layer, 1 for the very bottom, and 1 for the very top. So this is what I want you to do. First, we're going to cut this one out, the bigger size. I'm going to put this against the edge of my previous marking. And these ones, we're not going to mark 1/2 inch inward. We're going to mark them as they are. Grab your pen and just follow this line all the way to the other side. And this is wadding, so keep your perspective. We're not dealing with millimeters. It has to be as close as it can, but it's all rough measures. We're going to fade these edges, so it's very difficult to measure. Now that you've cut these or marked these, it's time to cut them, okay? First, we're going to cut these 2, and then we're going to use the rest as a replica. And try not to cut any more than you need. Now, we're going to split this one, so we don't need to cut 2 of this. However, we do need 2 of this, so we can put this right here, like so, mark around it, and cut again. Okay, so we have 2 of these, we'll put them on top of one another. And now it's time to cut the 3rd layer. You can cut the 3rd layer by placing it here. And if you notice that you're missing a little bit of an edge, don't worry about that. As long as you're as close as possible to the shape that is required. So that's that. We're going to need 2 of this. We can easily get 1 more out of here. Now I'm trying to move this as little as possible to prevent all of this mess going up in the air. So we've cut these 2, and now it's time to cut the last layer, and we're going to need 6 of these in total. So we have plenty of wadding to do that with. Let's see. So this is a good size. I'm going to use this as a template. It fits on here. So that's pretty good. So 6 of these. I already have one. So 5 more to go. Let's see. I can get another one from here. And one thing I have to also say, if you are using the material itself to cut the next piece, always use your first piece cut, because the second one is going to be slightly bigger or smaller, and then the third one is going to go smaller or bigger according to that, and then it's going to change completely. And so your first one is going to be this small and the last one really big. So always use the first one. So now we have 6 pieces of these. The rest we can fold, put away. Before I start doing anything, I always remove some of these fluffs that I already have. To make everything clear for you, these are all the layers that we're going to have. Carefully split this from the middle. It should open up very easily, but be careful that you don't thin it out unevenly. Like so. That's one pad. Then we have the second piece, like so, mirrored, and a slightly bigger one on top, like so. And then we have one on top, one at the bottom, and then one on top again, which is quilted onto the canvas, okay? So that's going to be here, that's going to be here, and then the other one is going to be quilted to the canvas, like so, all right? Now, it's very important for our pad to be as smooth as we can get it. Therefore, we require to fade the edges, okay? So what we're going to do is the following. One piece at a time, you're going to put your fingers about 1/2 inch away from the edge. You can also do it like this. Take a pinch of wadding out and put this somewhere in the bin or a bag or next to you and clear that up, okay? And we're gonna go all around the sides, but leave the armhole part completely cut as it is, okay? So, and if you want to have good technique, don't try to grab it like this, try to grab it like from the sides as your finger is next to it. On to the next. So, now that we have this, we can put these aside and start with the other layers in sequence. If you notice that these are very thick and it's difficult for you to take it out in one pinch, do one pinch from the top, one pinch from the bottom. So like this. Like so. Now again, leave the armhole side free. When you run your fingers over the edges, it should feel very smooth. If you notice, for example, that it's still a bit lumpy, you can take a little bit off just from the very top, like that. Only from the top. Obviously, this all depends on how thick your wadding is, but if it's as thick as what we have here, you can do that, okay? So that feels a lot smoother. Some areas need a little bit more plucking. Feel around. Should feel like a very smooth transition. And if you do this a little bit, you know, it's gonna fade all of that into the same amount. But don't keep doing it because you'll end up with nothing. So do this in moderation as much as I have done and continue to the next piece. So this can go right here on top and we can start with the next one. Okay, and then layer the top again. So, layer the top. Some of you may grab this and try to pluck it, but you can't do that. You're holding it too tight. You have to just rest your hand on it, use it as a guide, and then start plucking. With the 3 smaller pieces that we have, we are going to fade the edges on all of them to the same degree. So don't try to make one smaller than the other, okay? They're not going to be layered on top of one another directly. So just do exactly as you did, but try not to end up with nothing. So be a little bit more careful with how much you're taking. Don't remove like 1/2 inch from the edge, just a little bit to smooth things out, and then take a little bit off from one end from the top to create a smoother transition. So that's one, that's two, and that's three. Same on this side. This is how much I have plucked away from all these layers. I would encourage you to keep these if you want to make a pincushion or a ham, or if you're, desperate for some wadding and you have to make a shoulder pad, you can still make a shoulder pad with some of these bits, or you can use it for something else. Definitely don't throw it away because it's a waste. So let's do a quick evaluation. Have a look and see if everything that you have pretty much looks more or less like what I have here in front of me. Now you may wonder, hey, how do I know whether I should put this upside down or not? That's a very easy thing to assess. You can take your original drawing, first of all, see how exact the shape is as you're drawing. If it's more or less the same, then there is no upside or downside. You can just use the side that you have plucked from the top as your very upper side. So it goes from small to wide, okay? These are very smooth. They don't feel lumpy. They feel thick at the base, at the very top, but not at the ends. And you can go through each layer trying to remove some of the excess by just brushing it towards the outer edges and remove the remainder. And then you can stack them up again. So one thing I noticed, for example, is that this has ended up being a lot narrower than this. I will simply remove a little bit more from the wider one, not too much, just to make sure they are pretty equal. And now what I do before I do anything else with the three smaller pieces is I take this piece of pad, make sure the edges of the armhole side are perfectly aligned, hold the smallest part down and just brush my fingers over it like so. What this does is, first of all, you have to do this carefully, but it removes some of the excess fluff that would otherwise create bulk, and it blends everything together, and you can at the same time feel whether there is a lot of excess on the surface or not. It basically evens everything out. If you feel a lumpy area, go back and reduce it. But if you just follow the instructions, it should be pretty smooth. And as I said before, you can be hypnotized and keep on doing this until you're left with a small piece. So don't overdo it. Just assess, and as soon as it's smooth, stop. That's one side. Now that you've done both, here's an important part to assess. Take both pads, make sure they are, first of all, mirrored, and they're not both left side or the right side, and then feel whether they roughly have the same height. Obviously, you can put them against one another to assess this. I feel that this side is a little bit thicker. So what I can do is to see which layer is causing that. And it seems to be a little bit from the top. And that's it. That's a lot better. So you can do this for the outer edges, the inner edges. This part is a little bit lumpy. And that's it. So what's the next thing? We are going to add the top layer, and then we're going to start quilting, and the layer underneath is going to be added once we have pasted all these layers to the shell canvas. So put these to side, keep these two with it. Actually, take one of them out. We're going to need that for the quilting. Put these to the side, clear your board, take out your domette, open it up, like so. Keep your selvage to your right-hand side. Take one of your canvas shells, put it on top of the domette, so that the point of the canvas shell is pointing towards that corner, okay? This is very important. What you need is the entire armhole edge to be on the bias along with the rest of these areas at the back. So obviously some of this line is going to fall on the straight, some of this is going to fall on the straight, but this piece and this piece has to fall on the bias. Now, we require from a flattened state at least 1 inch around this entire pad from top to bottom, all around. So take a pencil or a graphite piece, mark a nice 1 inch all around, and this is going to be the part that is going to cover the entire pad. The reason why we need all this extra around is because we're going to fold some of the edges inwards, but when we shape and stretch it, it's going to deform and narrow down a little bit, so we require some extra, okay? So cut this out, and then we're going to cut the next piece. Now that we've cut this, fold it over, put it somewhere safe. Take the other corner just below it, and now what I want you to do is exactly the same. However, this time you're just going to allow 3/8 to 1/2 inch, that's a centimeter or 1.2 all around. This is going to be the bottom of the pad, which is not going to be folded in, and because we are going to get relative layer length over one another, the layer underneath is going to be a lot smaller than the rest, and so the remainders are going to pass out, which is therefore not necessary to create a bigger piece, okay? So let's cut this out, remove these tiny amounts which are going to be useless, put this to the side, and now what we're going to do is we're going to cut out the piece that is going to be quilted over the wadding that we put on the shell canvas. So for that, you can take a piece of scrap like this, fold the rest of your domette. We're going to need all of this for our wing pads, so try not to touch that. Or if you've made a mistake and you have to cut again, try to save as much as you can from this area. We require our wadding. It can be just on the straight grain, that's fine, along the selvage. We require our domette to be at least 1 inch wider than the shape of our wadding, okay? Here we already have a reference, or you can just simply place your wadding on top of your domette, cut about 1 inch around it. And now I want you to grab your Silesia. You can take a small corner. This is the piece that we cut for the body canvas, the side piece, so you can cut it from somewhere here and cut exactly the same shape all around. And fold this back and put it somewhere safe. We're going to prepare our shell canvas to be quilted. I want you to take your domette and cut 1/2 inch inwards, like so. Your Silesia stays as it is. Now, we're going to take both of your waddings and we're going to make sure that they end up exactly the same size. Now, this one feels a bit more chunky than the other. So first thing I have to do is to make sure they are exactly the same. So I had to remove a little bit of the layers. This feels pretty good. I will fade the edges a little bit more. Hold the ends. With an unpicker, you can just go over it a bit, soften up some of those edges, and allow them to be removed. Again, if you have to remove a little bit from the very top layer, feel free to do that. You have to end up with something like this. Just a small little pad with faded edges, like that. The thickness of this, as I hold it without it being compressed, is about 3/8. When I compress it, it's about 1/8 of an inch, okay? So let's make this one exactly the same as this. These two look pretty similar. Now, grab both of your canvas shells, like so, with the Silesia strip upwards. Then place your pieces of wadding right in the center of your pad and make sure the edge of your wadding is as close to the edge of your canvas. Do not allow it to go over like that. Keep it as close to the edge as possible. Now this one feels still a little bit too thick, so I'm just going to remove a little bit more from it. Do not assume that your layers of wadding are exactly the same thickness, so you have to really keep on assessing this. So this is pretty good. Now what I'll do is I'll take a needle and I'll baste the wadding to the canvas shell. Do not make a knot. Start from the top, go into the edge of the wadding. Careful you don't pluck anything when you're taking your needle out. Like so, and do a loose back tack, like so, and do the same going all around it to keep it in place. Again, make sure that this is in line with the edge. Don't allow it to go over the edge. Back tack, go through the middle once, come out the middle again, go over the other edge, and that's it. Now the other one. Now we have the layer of wadding, which is the 6th layer on the very top of our canvas shell. Feel and see if they are still the same thickness. So at the moment, this one feels flatter than this one, so I'll just remove a few bits through the basting, like that. Yeah, that feels pretty good. Now, you have your pieces of domette. Open it up, put it on top. Again, make sure the edges of your domette are matching the edges of your canvas. Thread your needle. Make sure the domette is covering everything evenly all around, and do a very quick baste through it. Do not use a knot. Just a subtle big baste to hold it in place so that when you go underneath the machine, things don't walk around. All right, again, feel whether they are both the same. Don't make one pad completely and then the other. Make both of them at the same time. There is a lot more inconsistencies going on here compared to, for example, the body canvas, because the thickness of your layers you have to assess. They are not always the same. So you're trying to get your pads as good as you can and as identical as possible. It's also a way to train your sensory touch. Okay, and now it's time for the Silesia. Again, if you've cut everything correctly, the Silesia should cover everything evenly. Thread your needle and baste. What we have done now is prepared our canvas shells to be quilted right at the very ends of the shoulders. By the time this is quilted, this will turn into a very stiff surface. It's going to be compressed and become very firm. And when the shoulders are attached and the sleeves go in, the sleeves can't easily create a dip in this area like that. Okay, so what I want you to do is to mark, first of all, about 5 millimeters away from the edge, like that. And then on the machine, keep on stitching with a large stitch length of 3 to 4 millimeters, straight rows like this. So every time you reach the edge of your Silesia, you make sure you go a stitch over it, square over, continue the cycle, and do that with both. So I'm going to go to the machine and you can follow me and we'll do it together. The first things that I want you to know is that this is the thread that you should be machining with if you have purchased a bundle. This is the same color as your fabric or your canvas. I'm going to be using black thread just like I did with a zigzag so that you can see exactly what I'm doing. Now, before you start stitching, make sure to flip over your canvas and see whether your materials are going away from the edge. If that's the case, feel free to trim some of this net according to your canvas edge. Because when you are doing your first machine row, you really want that to be a foot's width away from the edge, not more, not less. Okay, so that trimmed away, let's begin. Put your stitch length on about 4 or 5 millimeters. Start a little bit further back and have something like a screwdriver that allows you to hold this down while the foot is pushing against it. We do not want our Silesia or our wadding, despite them being basted, to move. All right, let's begin. So once you get to the edge, go 1 stitch over your Silesia, square over, and go back with the thread being aligned with the edge of your foot. And repeat this process. Once you're done, you can just continue sewing a little bit further. There's no need for a back tack in the beginning or the end. Now I'm going to do exactly the same with the other side. So that's it. Let's take this back to our board, remove the basting threads, and continue with the rest of the process. We have now quilted the top ends of our shoulder pad. When you try to bend this, because this has been stitched flat on a machine, you may see it break. Now, to some extent, this is exactly what we want to happen because it's that rigidity that breaks that canvas when it tries to go around. However, we want to treat it with every step that we progress. So the first thing I want you to do is to grab a sleeve board, put this on the edge of the sleeve board. You can put some moisture if you want, but not too much, just a little bit of a mist. And then begin to press as you bend the ends around the sleeve board. You can also do this on a narrow ham. The idea here is to just relax the fibers so that we reduce some of that break without reducing the firmness. Same for this side. Now, when you try to bend it, it's a little bit less resistant and it can still bend smoothly without creating a square shape. Okay, so we are now going to shape and then baste our domette on top of our shell. Grab the biggest piece that you have cut, spray it, press it smooth, and now the idea is to turn this into a shape that resembles our shell. You will have to use some water and a lot of ironwork. So do as I do. Spray this area wet and stretch it. Try to stretch by holding a larger surface. Don't just pinch a small piece and pull it like that. Try to really hold an entire area by using your palm or your entire finger, like that. This will allow you to stretch an entire surface without pleating too many areas. So that's one side. Now what we're going to do is we're going to stretch the back. So flatten everything here, spray some water. Instead of stretching the edge, hold this area, introduce the iron from here and pull. Pull more as your iron enters the surface. And then move backwards, doing the same thing. And then gradually work your way towards the edge. Now that you've done that, you can already see it has a little bit of that shape, okay? But that's not enough. We are going to stretch both sides as well. So starting with the right side, put everything flat and pull as you introduce the iron onto the surface. Like so. Be careful not to pleat anything. And now the other side. And that's it. Now we've stretched the front, the back, and the sides. Let's flip this over and do exactly the same to this side. So how do we test this? Well, take one of your canvas shells, lay the fronts flat, allow the back to lift up. Place both your layers of domette on top of it. Clear. Allow it to move as natural as possible. And then, if you can pinch your surplus length together with the domette and you don't feel any tension between these areas and it just lays on top like skin does on flesh, then you've done a good job. If it's not the case and you have a lot of surpluses, keep on stretching some of these areas and check again. Now this is pretty good. You can do something else. Move the shape over to the side. see if any tension occurs, move the shape over to the front, see if any tension occurs, move it to the other side, and that gives you plenty of ways to examine this shape, okay? So this is pretty good, so I'm happy with this. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the top layer off, put this on the other shell, put that aside. We require a lot of room around our shell. So position this, allow everything to lay as natural as it does. We do not need a lot of space on the edge, it's really on the sides. And if you have plenty, well, then you're ready to go. So this is what you're going to do. Thread your needle with a basting thread. Make a knot. And then what I want you to do is to take a bite right at the very top, bend the pad along with the domette. Just brush with your fingers over the surface. Don't clear it flat or tight. Just allow the domette to rest on top of the canvas, all right? And then start basting. I'm basting about 3/8 away from the edge of the canvas with a stitch length of 3/4. And don't baste too tight, just baste loosely. Again, if you see any slight discrepancies or a mismatch, don't pull this tight. Just allow this to rest wherever it is resting. This is cut on the bias, it will compress beautifully. Once you reach the other side, flip everything over and do exactly as you just did. Back tack once, and that's it. Flip it over, and I want you to cut the edge of your pad, that's the armhole edge, completely flush with the canvas. So trim all this domette away. As for the sides, take a pencil, chalk or graphite, mark 5/8 away, that's 1.5 centimeters, and then transition that into 3/8 around the neck area. Why 3/8? Well, this is going to be folded onto itself, and whenever you fold your material along a convex line, you are creating surpluses. The bigger your material, the more that's going to result in a pleat. Therefore, we require a little bit less material in that area. That's pretty much it. When you flatten this, you may feel a little bit of surplus on top. That's absolutely fine. If anything, it's much preferable to have a little bit more surplus than nothing at all. That's that. I'm going to do exactly the same with the other side, and then we're going to baste our wadding onto our shell. All right, now, before we put anything on this side, I want you to mark with a Sharpie or a pen the top point of our seam, okay? So this is where the seam is going to be on the shoulder end, and this is where the seam is going to be on the neck end. And I want you to do this for both sides. We need these two marks whenever we are inserting our pad into the jacket. And don't be afraid of marking them just very bold with your pen. We don't want this to fade away or whatever. Let's go ahead and do this. We have already prepared all of these, so we don't need to do any layering. However, we do need to baste them in one by one. You can, if you're very experienced or you feel like the tough guy around, do all of it at once, but you will run the risk of these layers being pushed out like that while you're stitching. And when you're stitching and you have that going on, you have to unpick and do it all over again. So to prevent any risk of these sticking out, and they really should not, or else you'll lose the shape, we're going to baste them in one by one, okay? So thread your needle, double check before you do anything that the shape of this shell is going according to the shape that you have cut for it. In this case, that's correct. See, this is not correct. This is going the other way around, okay? And then start with the smallest size and align that with the center of this size with the center of this dot. like that. And I want you to keep the edge really flush as good as you can. And don't feel afraid of really pinching this. If anything, feel free to spray this a little bit and to press this flat like that. That will make it more manageable. It's okay for it to get compressed. If anything, that's what we're going to do later on anyway. So you might as well start doing that right off the bat. Align, keep everything flat. Don't try to bend this in a stupid curve or anything. And then baste. Just like we basted the whole wadding piece for the quilting. Now, for this side, it's okay to make a knot because it's going to be covered by wadding and such. But if you're really fussy, you can take it off like that. Keep the focus on the edge and make sure it's really parallel. That's very important. And try to keep it as flat as you can. Don't bend it the other way or whatsoever. And you also don't have to go through all the layers when you're basting. Enough for this to be held in its place. And then here you can go up and down very gently. Don't pull the thread too much. Really bring this up to the edge. No need for a back tag. And it's time for the next layer. Spray this, press it flat, align the center with that of your dot, match the edges, and start basting. Repeat this for all the other layers. Always make sure you baste the edge of the armhole. That's very important. And then when you reach the last layer, make sure you position it so that you have a strip of canvas showing of about 1/2 inch. Now, you can stretch this a little bit so that you cover all sides equally. And you can stretch the sides a little bit just to create that shell shape effect. You can start basting. Now, the type of basting that you do is not really relevant. You have seen me do a padding stitch or a running stitch. If anything, a running stitch is even better because a padding stitch may pull these ends inwards and create bubbles. So that's something to keep in mind. And once you're done with the edge, you can go inwards to keep the center well in place. Just a running stitch through, and that's plenty. Then we have our last layer, and that's this little fella right there. Make sure it's well aligned with the center of the pad, and it definitely doesn't come out. I would recommend you go up and down while basting this one. Once you're done, you should have all the layers as much as possible really parallel to the edge of your canvas. If anything, just a little bit on the inside, okay? Do not push anything outwards. Once you've done that, this is what you're going to do. Take a long piece of thread, thread your needle, make a knot, insert the needle from the canvas side or from the domette side, and go over the edge while bringing everything really as well in line as possible with a stitch length of 1/2 inch. Back tack once, and that's it. It's time to baste the inside. Grab your domette, which is the smaller of the ones you've cut. Give it a spray and repeat exactly the same process, but this time do not exaggerate the stretching. Just give it a little bit of shaping, and that's all. That's it. Let's remove one side. As you can see, I have the pad flat and I've somewhat inverted the pad. This is what I want you to do as well. Thread your needle, move in from the top side of the pad, through the middle of the seam, more or less, up and down the center. Doesn't have to be super exact as long as you go across like this. And try to keep the pad as flat as possible, if anything a little bit curved so that the inside becomes longer. This is very important. You do not want to do the logical thing and make the underneath layer shorter. So once you've done that, you will then bend the pad so you're inverting the pad and baste through. Now, we do not need to go over the edge of the canvas because we're not going to fold this in. We're going to cut this 1/8 away from the edge once we're done with the stitching. But for now, we are just going to bend this over against its natural tendency to move the other way around and baste. So this may feel very unnatural. Once you're done, back tack, and that's it. So your pad, as you can see, is going to look very unnatural now. However, once we're done stitching, it should give us a very smooth surface. The reason why we have done this and made this underneath layer so long is because we are dealing with a sponge-like material in between. Now, every time we pull our thread through, it's going to bring these together and, as you can see, pull material inwards up to the point that once you're done, this entire area is completely flat. It's going to have small cushions, as you'll see later on, which are going to help fill in the imperfections of the body and the imperfections of the pad layering to create a smooth top layer. All right, I'm going to do the exact same thing, all that I did to the other pad, and then we're going to prepare our silamide wax thread so that we can start stitching. When you're done, both of your shoulder pads should look pretty much the same. Keep in mind that because you're working with layers of wadding, it's very difficult to get both of them exactly the same. So your aim should not be to create replicas, although that's very good to do, but as close as possible is realistic. So keep things realistic. Don't try to overwork everything by trying to get the millimeters right. That's not going to do much. Another thing that I want to highlight is once you're done, put both of them against one another and see if the thicknesses of your pads and the way you have serged around the edges is the same. So for example, in my case, the right pad has been stitched a lot looser than the left pad, and you can see the ends are a little bit compressed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo these bastings and go over them one more time with less tension so that I have exactly the same edges. Apart from that, you can do certain tests. You can just go with your fingers over both, see if one is elevated more than the other. And if you do that with like 20 pads, at some point, it's going to be all very intuitive. So I'm going to redo this one, and then we're going to be ready for permanent stitching. I've stitched this again, and I have to really emphasize this. The point of this overcasting on the edge is not to compress the edge. It's just to hold everything on the edge so that none of the layers can poke through. If you create a very small bite, you will compress the edges and pull everything towards the edge, and so your inner layers or the smaller layers of your wadding are going to disappear kind of like on the edge, and then you won't have anything here. So big bites, loose tension, just to hold them from poking through the edge. That's it, okay? Now, to stitch our shoulder pads together, we need a strong thread. Inside your purple box, you'll find wax silamide thread with 3 number 7 needles in it. We're going to use this thread for padding the colors, the undercolor, that is, the lapels, finishing the linings, things like that. But before you start using it, I'm going to show you how to prepare it like a proper tailor does in a proper workshop. Here's what you have to do. The first thing we have to do is to take out all the 3 needles that we have inside the thread. We're going to need these needles and we don't want to lose them. So put them aside, and now you're ready for the next step. Take out the thread and unwrap it from the card. Once you've done that, take both ends and find the middle of the threads. Place them next to you, and now what we're going to do is the following. We're going to make a hole right in between the 2 cuts that we have in these 2 top corners. Go ahead and make a hole right there. With a pin, it's a lot easier to push down. Now, on either side of that hole, make one more hole. Just be very careful that you don't get too close to the cut that you have in those corners. These 3 holes are the holes that are going to hold our needles. What we're going to do is we're going to fold the card along this line here where we have the 3 holes. Now it's time to secure the card and hold it tightly together. Take an arm's length of basting thread, hook it into the cut that we have above the text, like that, and wrap the thread around these two, just the flap, twice. So that's once and twice. Okay? Now, we're going to wrap the thread around both layers of the card, and we're going to do that 10 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay? Make sure that everything is snug and bring your threads nice and tight together. Okay? Now we're going to have to fasten off. Lift up this flap and bring the thread underneath it and hook it into the cuts that we have started off with. So once you've done 2 loops around the cuts, bring the thread underneath, pull, and cut. Now it's time to secure the threads that we have here, our waxed thread, to our card. First thing we have to do is to put the needles inside our card, like so. Now, flip the card over so that the logo is upside down and you have your needles facing upwards. We're going to need a strip of fabric or a piece of cord. If you've got the bundle, you also have some Silesia and you can cut a 20 centimeter or an 8-inch long strip of that Silesia and 1 centimeter wide. Just make sure that you cut well along the grain so that you can fray it a little bit and just have a nice ribbon-like tape. Put the tape underneath the card like so and flip both ends upwards like that. Then take both ends of your ribbon, hold the card in your hands like this, slightly push down with your thumb to create a gap between the thread and the card, and slide the end of the ribbon underneath your basting thread and pull upwards halfway through your ribbon, like so. Okay? Now, take the middle of your waxed threads and place them underneath your basting threads. All you have to do now is to simply pull the ends of your loop through the hole, hold the card, pull upwards and forwards, like that. Okay? Now, once you've done that, you can simply grab both ends of the thread and pull a little bit tighter, like that. That's it. Now you can flip it over and you've got your card and your thread all ready together with your needles, and you can put a pin through this to hold and hang it somewhere nice while having everything you need all together at once. If you want to take out a yarn or a thread, simply hold the thread right at the end, pull one, and without the rest getting entangled, you can easily take out a thread. This is a great way to prepare your thread if you have it waxed, or if you want to keep everything organized along with your needles and color codes. So now that we have prepared our waxed thread, what I want you to do is to keep the number 7 needles in there. Do not use them. We will need them for the undercolor and the lapels and the finishing. But instead, I want you to take out one of the number 5 needles of your basting thread or your marking thread. Because our pads are quite thick, we require a slightly longer needle to stitch through them. The number 7s are going to be too short, okay? Let's do this. First, let's pin our Silesia tape right here into the board cloth so that we can actually hold this like that, take one of the threads out without all the threads bunching up, okay? So that's that. You can also hang this from somewhere if that's easier. Now, what we have to do is to do some marking. The first marking that we're going to do is going to be a line from the edge of the canvas about 3/8 in. So I'm going to just mark that with my piece of graphite all around. You can do this with a pencil or with just like a white chalk. Don't use black chalk, don't use blue chalk. Try to keep it as neat as possible. Once you've drawn that line, the next line that I want you to draw is a line which is 3/8, that's 1 centimeter, away from the edge of your canvas right here along the armhole. Now mark another set of lines all the way to the end with the same distance of 3/8 all the way through, and keep them parallel to your initial line, which is parallel to the edge of your canvas. This is how it's going to look. Make sure that you keep your distance very close to 3/8. Don't go 3/4, 5/8, 2 centimeters. You should not have a very wide gap between them, okay? We're going to do a running stitch from one end to the other with our waxed silamide thread. If you don't have waxed silamide thread, you can double your machine stitch. Use button thread, but make sure that the thread you use is not too thick. Once the fabric covers this shoulder pad and you press on top of the fabric, you should not see the markings of the thick thread. So use a strong thread, but make sure the thread is thin enough to sink into the domette, okay? So hold the end of your waxed silamide thread and pull one strand through, like so. You do not need to take the wax off. Take your number 5 needle, thread your needle, and this is what you're going to do. You're going to start from the top with fastening on with a bite size of 1/4 of an inch. That's 6 millimeters, like so. No knots. Now you're going to make a loop. That's the first loop. The second loop, you're going to go clockwise or counterclockwise. Doesn't matter, whichever side you choose. I'm going to do clockwise over, so to create a knot, like so. Okay? You're going to do that one more time. And then, so now you've made 3 loops, of which 2 of them have a knot. You're going to make 2 more regular loops. 1, 2. Okay? That's just how we start each thread. So if your thread ends and it's finished and you're going to start a new row, you're going to have to use this back tack. You can also just, do the first 2 with a loop. The specific order of how you loop doesn't matter, as long as you do 5 loops, of which 2 have a knot, okay? That's very important. There's going to be a lot of pressure and resistance from these wadding layers, and your stitching may come undone if you only do like 1 or 2 loops. It's not going to be enough, okay? So that's that. Now, here is the difficult part for most of you. You are going to have to use your hand as if it's a machine. What do I mean by that? You're going to have to keep the back part of your hand parallel to the floor. Use your thimble and needle so that your needle goes straight up perpendicular to the floor. Why is this important? Because when you go up and down, which is something we're going to do in a moment, you should not end up with your needle on an angle so that every bite is in a different direction. You want this to go up and down like a machine so that you end up with neat rows of stitches on the top and the same neat rows of stitches at the bottom. It's not always possible. It requires practice. Even I don't get it always right. However, if you are conscious of what you have to do, chances are that you're going to end up with a successful rows of stitching, okay? So this is what we're going to do. Hold your pad as flat and straight as you can. Take your needle, go straight downwards. Don't go at an angle, okay? So like that. Distance of your stitch length should be 3/8, okay? Don't make big stitches. Don't go long stitches. Don't make them too small. So we're going to go straight down like so. And if you look through it, you're kind of like perpendicular to the edge of the canvas, all right? And you're going to go through all layers. And when you come upwards, make sure you're not holding your pad on an angle, because that again creates like an awkward stitching. Hold the surface of your pad parallel to the floor while you're holding your needle perpendicular to it, like so. Turn it over and see if you're roughly on the same line. If you are, continue, okay? Now, we don't have to do any kind of pulling yet. We're going to do that in a second. I'm just going to repeat this. So, straight down, hold the pad parallel to the floor, needle perpendicular to it. This is going to be challenging for some of you, like so. Pull through. And repeat all the way to the very end. So I've reached the middle now. I'm going to flip it over so that you can see. So these are nicely on a row. However, this one suddenly goes diagonal. It's okay to some extent if you have a few stitches here and there like this. However, I'm going to take it out and I'm going to redo it because I want to get this right all the way through, and I want you to do the same. That means you're going to get deliberate practice of getting proper stitching through your pad until it becomes easier and easier to do so. Now, one more thing before I take this out. Once you reach the middle part of your pad, so let's say you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches, or how many stitches you do, hold your end point, which is your fastening on point, and pull this thread tightly through. Don't rip it, just pull firmly through and then let it go, okay? You do this a few times, the thread tension will remain in there at some point, and it's really important for us to have these layers firmly pinched together, okay? We're going to do this all the way with every line. So I'm going to redo this and then I'm going to talk you through the rest. Again, I've reached the middle of the pad. I've done like 4 or 5 stitches. I'm going to pull this like so, let it go and continue. If you find it easier, like I do, you can kind of like pull through, look at it from the other side, make sure you keep a nice row of stitching so that you can at least see where your needle is going. That makes things a lot more easier, for sure. So once you reach the edge of your line, again, take your thread, hold the end of your fastening on, just pull this, give it a few tugs until it doesn't go back anymore, okay? So now you can see it's very tense here. What I want you to do then, before you continue, is to do 1 back tack, 1 across between the 2 lines, 1 on the new line, again, 1 back tack, and then continue, all right? So I'm gonna do a few stitches, pull hard, then continue, reach the end, do exactly as I did here, and go all the way. So my thread is almost done. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a back tack, like I said, and then go between the 2 lines, that's this row and this row, on the line that shows me the edge, and then here do 5 back tacks. So the first 2, for example, I can do with a loop to create a knot, and the next 3 I can just do as regular back tacks. And I'm going to start in the same way on the new line. Now the idea is for you to have all these rows of stitchings that are as consistent as you can get it. Do not allow the edges to get folded or whatsoever. You really need to have them just sit there flat. We're going to later trim the inside, fold the outside over it, and do all of that, okay? So don't get them twisted or folded or whatsoever. Also, while I did suggest that you can kind of like look back and forth while you're basting, I highly recommend to do it properly, exercise the proper way, which is hold this parallel to the floor, needle perpendicular to it. I can't emphasize that enough. Don't cheat and turn yourself into a, you know, a less skilled tailor. Do the proper thing, learn it properly, and then it will be your superpower forever. Another thing that I have to emphasize while you're doing this is that you are not supposed to stitch this pad in a curve. You have to stitch it as flat as you can, okay? If you stitch it in a curve and the pad goes a little bit over back into a flat surface, maybe the shoulder requires that, you're gonna have all these bumps and lumps on the top of your shoulder pad, which is really not desirable. It will mess up the entire line that you're trying to achieve, okay? And another thing, if you notice that maybe some of your lines have not been a distance of 3/8, ignore those lines and just follow by eye a distance of 3/8 or correct the lines. Don't just go with the lines if they are wrong, okay? Now, notice that every time I'm fastening off or I'm fastening on, it always happens on these edges. For the best results, try to do the same. don't really fasten on and off in the middle of the pad. You're going to get inconsistent pressures, and what you really want is for the pad to be compressed from one end to the other, not in between, okay? Keep that please in mind. Now, as you reach the thinner part of the pad, which is just this end, you don't have to go up and down anymore. You can just make sure you have a very good bite size on the other side and proceed with just regular running threads as you would stitch anything else. So that's the stitching done. You can now see that the shoulder pad is really showing the shape that it has, whereas in the beginning it was a bit difficult to see through all of the flimsiness. Now all the layers are compressed and the true shape of the shoulder pad is revealing itself. One thing important, why did we use a running stitch? Why did we not hold this and try to do a padding stitch or some other stitch? There is a very good reason for this. So imagine when you have a running stitch, that running stitch goes up and down along a line. When you pull both ends of that running stitch, the upper threads and the lower threads want to straighten out into one level. When they straighten out into one level, or at least try to straighten out, they put pressure from the top and the bottom and thereby hold everything like both of our hands, kind of like a sandwich together. Now here's the part. Whenever you bend this pad, what you'll do is you increase some of that tension on the top surface, and that tension compresses the wadding layers even further. Now this all happens on a very kind of like, it's all very delicate and very subtle. However, the combination of all those steps together create a firm surface which does not lose its shape easily and allow you to actually get a line that is going to last for a few years. You don't want your shoulder pad to kind of like die, let's say, after like a few months of use or exposure to water or anything of the kind, okay? So don't do any other stitch than a running stitch in the direction that the pad is going to bend. So not even a running stitch in this direction, all right? What my recommendation, in fact, would be is to make a shoulder pad and do all sorts of different stitches on it. Do the running stitch in this direction, do it diagonally, do a padding stitch to really internalize the things that I have experienced, which I'm telling you kind of like in a theoretical way, although I'm showing part of it, but for yourself to experience that, it's a very different knowledge integration into your hands and into your brains, okay? So next step. Now what we're going to do, as you can see, all these stitches have pulled the edges of our domette inwards. Now, these bubbles and all these discrepancies here, they are absolutely fine. In fact, whenever this bends, you see all these pockets of wadding, which are going to be pressed by our body and flattened. Now, the areas that don't press against it will have all these cushions that will enable a smooth surface. If the inside is too smooth, the lumps on your shoulders are actually going to distort the shoulder line on the surface of the pad, all right? Now, what we're going to do, ideally, this is not pulled inwards that much, but fortunately, we have enough to cover for it. But what I want you to do is to trim the inner layer of your domette all around 5 millimeters away from the edge of your canvas. Be careful not to cut through your threads. Now, what we're going to do is I want you to take one of your silamide threads and fold this over. Now, we have already trimmed the top, and the top should not be really affected by the stitching. So I'm not going to trim around here. Although if I did have inconsistent edges, which I don't have at the moment, I would have trimmed everything neat. But the outside seems to be fine. What you want is 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 roughly speaking, going into a narrower edge, which is about 3/8 around this curve, okay? Now, this is what I want you to do. fold this neat and tight against the edge of your canvas, and where your first row of stitching is visible, fasten on. You do not have to go through all the layers, although it's okay to do that. That's absolutely fine. If you want to do that, do that. I'm going to do that in fact right now, but you don't have to. Again, I'm going to fasten on really well with 2 loops and then 3 ordinary loops. That makes 5 in total. And then I'm going to do a raw edge running stitch, which means that I'm going to bring my needle over the edge, take a bite of about 1/4, like so. And now I'm not going through everything. Again, you can do that if you want. Go back over the edge in front of where the thread came out and take another bite, like so. Okay, don't pull too hard, just a little bit. And I'm going to continue doing that all the way over. As you can see, the surplus is trapped between the stitches here, but that's fine. We're going to press that and that's going to flatten through the heat and the weight of the iron. So for example, here, I don't have a lot of wadding, I don't have a lot of domette, so I will go through all the layers just to make sure everything is held in place. You know, the only difference is more aesthetic reasons. You know, you're going to see some stitching on the surface, and you know, in the final analysis, it doesn't matter whether you see stitching or not. The main thing is that the stitching is there in the way it should be to hold everything firmly together. All of these things are small aesthetic choices. You know, if you want to make a model pad, let's say, for like a showroom or, you know, for a nice social media Instagram photo, then you can do perfect stitching, you know, perfect consistency on all edges. But if you want to make a practical jacket, to be very honest, you have to make priorities, and that's the least important part of the functionality of the pad. Now, if we talk about aesthetics, it's another story. We are now just focused on the functionality of the pad. Once you get the functionality right, you can do aesthetically whatever you wish, because you have understood, or at least the idea is for you to understand what changes will affect the practicality of the pad. Never try to just make a nice looking stitched pad. Always keep in mind what the purpose of each stitch is. And once you've understood those rules, then you can break them. So here you can see I'm doing a smaller stitching just to keep everything nice and neat in place. Once you reach your last visible stitch, you can fasten off, again 5 times. And you've done all the stitching that your pad required. Now, a few things. Obviously, if you take your time and you're very careful, you can make a very hyper consistent, beautiful stitching on the edge right here to make everything look pleasing. If you are a little bit more careful, you can avoid certain areas which have a little bit more fullness than what you ideally would want. However, what I want to emphasize and tell you is that if you have small overlaps and small pleating areas in the middle of your pad, or some areas around here where you still have some cushioning, it's absolutely fine, unless it's like a super big lump. But anything that you can kind of like distribute with your finger is fine. These are all going to be pressed. Now you can also sometimes do the other way around, where you fold the outer layer of domette in first, then you fold the layer underneath over it and do the same stitching. Practically, there is no difference, okay? So the main thing is to have a smooth transition into nothing around the edges. Now what I want you to do is the following. Remove all the basting threads. All right, so once you've taken the basting threads out, the next thing that I want you to do is to trim the edges. How are we going to do that? Well, first of all, it's very obvious. I want you to trim everything to the edge of your canvas on the top layer. Now, with me, I have a little bit going over it right here, so I can trim a little bit further back. However, just make sure that you don't cut more than you really have to, because we don't want to lose this edge. That's the first layer. Just do it in stages. Don't try to trim the entire pad. You won't be able to do that. The next thing is to trim the layer underneath. If you have any surpluses around here, that's fine. It's time to do that casting stitch over the edge one more time. Again, we're going to do it very loosely just to hold these edges and prevent any fluff from being pulled out or whatsoever until we finish the jacket and then do a final trimming, all right? So start with a bite size of about 3/8. That means that the edge of your canvas where your needle comes out is about 3/8. Fasten off twice and keep on stitching with a basting distance of 3/8 all the way to the very end. Make sure that the tension is just enough to hold the layers together. We do not want to create a tight edge. When you're done, your pad should look something like this. Not only does this basting hold everything in place, it also gives us an accurate reading during the fittings. So for example, imagine that this is on someone's shoulder and we take the sleeves off. We can see exactly what the thickness of this pad is. If you don't have this basting, things will open up and the pad will look as if it's wider and thicker than it actually is. And so sometimes when you do need a few more extra layers to elevate the pad, or maybe a few less layers, you really require an accurate reading. And so that helps with that as well. Now it's time to press. What you have to do is to press on a sleeve board. The purpose of our pressing is to compress the layers of wadding through heat and moisture. We have already compressed some of these layers with the stitching, which is these horizontal rows, but we also now have to just compress them even further with some steam and some heat. Now we're going to have to do this in parts. So we have all this extra length and we want to keep that in place. So what we're going to do is we're going to do it in sections, and every time we're going to allow one area to remain flat while the rest of the length can easily be away in the air without being compressed or flattened with the weight of the iron. Okay, so I'll start from here. Apply moisture and carefully introduce the iron and allow the iron to really get that heat through all the layers of wadding. You should visualize the heat going through the first layer of domette, then the canvas, then the wadding, then the layer of domette underneath, and so on and so forth. Now here, where you have most of the elevation and then kind of like fading into nothing, try to press it in the same way. Try to bring your iron in and then slowly fade out as you're pressing. And notice how long I'm holding the iron on. I'm not just doing a surface press. I'm really trying to get the heat through all the layers as much as possible. You can use a steam iron if you have a steam iron, but make sure that you don't continuously put on the steam. At some point you want this to dry off. So now I'm just going to dry everything off. And although the purpose of this pressing is not to shape the pad, I don't try to flatten it, okay? So we want to compress all these layers, but we're not shaping the pad, we're just compressing. However, we don't want the shape to get lost or to be distorted in a severe way. So be careful with the way you're pressing. Do it in sections and try to maintain this shape at all times without creating breaks or lumps or creases into it. So as you can see, I'm neatly going all around it and I'm trying to keep everything in place. Now you can, at some point, get rid of your sleeve board. Take out your Flintstone ham and place this on the ham and dry it off further. But keep in mind, you are not shaping the pad, okay? Now at some point, maybe when you put it on your shoulders, you may stretch this edge a little bit more or this edge a little bit more. But when I'm putting it on the ham and I'm pressing it, I'm not trying to shape it. You have to be realistic. What happens is if you make the pad correctly and everything is in the right place, in the right way, whatever you do to the pad, it will maintain its shape. When we finish the jacket, there's going to be a step whereby we have to flip the armhole inside out and stitch through the edges of the sleeves and the shoulders and the canvas. Now, you can imagine that your pad is going to get all twisted and, flipped back and crumpled up, and, you may think it's going to lose its shape. It won't. And if there's going to be a little bit of a rough and tumble with the pad, that's fine, because eventually once the jacket is done, you can press it back into shape, and that will be the final press. For now, all we're doing is just to make sure that this steam dries off and we have a neat looking pad. So again, I am not trying to shape the pad. The shape is already there. We have 2 darts. We have done some stretching before we put all the layers of wadding. We're just finishing it with some final touches. So this is our shoulder pad. It's actually quite funny because once you press, you really get a flat surface and you start to see how inconsistent or how consistent your stitching is. It's very difficult. I mean, if you're doing the pad every day and you're making these pads, obviously you're going to have at some point a good feel for it, and you're going to have very neat stitching. The most important element of this pad is its final shape, so that by the time it goes around the shoulder, it maintains that line, it's firm on the outer edges, and obviously the more you make them and the more consistently you make them, the neater all these rows of stitching are going to be. The distances should be as even as possible, and this, to my own standards, doesn't really look nice. You can have perhaps a more consistent stitching here on the edge, going through all the layers or not going through all the layers, either showing all these stitches on the edge consistently or not showing them. But that's secondary, because this is going to be an internal thing. It's not going to be visible. Now, compared to what we had here, you can see the pad is a little bit condensed. It's really not that thick. It's about 1 inch thick. That's 2.5 centimeters. However, it has a lot of shape. And if I put this on my shoulder, what you have to see is a line starting from the neck, give a smooth silhouette all the way to the shoulder end, okay? Now, here is how you test the pad. First of all, you have to put it on your shoulder so that the dot that you have here is in the middle of your neck from a side view, and the dot that you have here is really on that shoulder apex that I discussed with you, okay? Then you're going to take your hands, the palm of your hand along with the flat side of your fingers, and run your hands over the pad. It should not feel lumpy or inconsistent with your body. It's as if you're running your hands on this side of your body without the pad. It all feels like one, natural. Same has to happen on here, all right? So from the side, it's not super thick, perfect, because it doesn't distort the armhole and therefore the sleeves. And from the front, it has exactly the line that we require. A good exercise to do is to take the other one, which you haven't stitched, put it on your shoulder, run your hands over it and see how this one feels, and see if this one feels better. This one, which is the finished one, should feel better, okay? So let's continue and do the other pad. I'm going to do exactly what I did here, and once we're done, we're ready to go to the next stage. So our second pad is done as well. I always do a final examination to see if both of them feel the same way. Do they have the same thickness? Do they have the same shape? And if I have 90% accuracy, I will proceed. Like I said, it's extremely difficult to get both of them exactly the same unless you're dealing with a very uniform sheet of wadding, which is often not the case. But as you develop your skills, you'll learn to make them as uniform as possible. I actually noticed that this pad is slightly thinner than the other one. Do I have to redo it? Do I have to add another layer? I will decide that usually during the fittings. There's no point to add something or to remove something if in the final analysis it has zero impact, unless you're doing it for aesthetic reasons or psychological reasons. So let's take this pad to the next stage. Finally, we have reached the end of a very intense lesson. We covered everything in 3 parts. In part 1, I discussed the 3 factors that are crucial for us to understand if we want to create beautiful shoulders. Factor number 1, anatomy. A shoulder is a negative surface curve. It's like a saddle. Factor number 2 is going to be seam position. We cannot randomly put our shoulder seams and our neck curves wherever we like. There is a correct position for each one of them. And factor number 3 is going to be seam design. Without it, no shoulder is complete. You can use seam design to accentuate the beautiful surface that you have created on a shoulder. Then we went to part 2. We discussed the industry standard, which is putting fullness in the back shoulder, and why I believe it's technically incorrect. And of course, we just finished part 3, which was everything you need to know about pagoda shoulder pads. First of all, a pagoda shoulder is not just a very thick pad. We are dealing with multiple layers that are layered in a very specific way, and every layer has a purpose. Obviously, if you want to do this successfully, you need the right canvas construction, which we have already covered in the previous lessons. And of course, you need to have the right pattern. You can't just randomly put any canvas construction or pattern on a shoulder pad like this and expect it to give you a killer silhouette, okay? Now, one thing I want to highlight. What I'm giving you here in terms of knowledge is only the tip of the iceberg. Why do I say that? I went through a long journey of a lot of trial and error to get to this knowledge and to understand the things that I've handed down to you. So you are inheriting unearned wisdom, as to say. Now, I'm not saying that to say you don't deserve it. I think you fully deserve it. But you're not getting the entire iceberg, let's say. This is only the tip of it. I want you to experiment with all sorts of materials. I want you to create intentionally bad shoulder pads. Make them big, make them small, so that you also gain the base of that iceberg and have a broad perspective. That's what I want for you. For the next lesson, we're going to do the shoulders. We're going to put them together and you'll see this pad in action. So I look forward to see you there. Take care. Now that you understand all of this, I think you are ready to cover with me. Ha! Wij kunnen dat later doen. Gewoon nog een keer doen, toch? Extra.